Welcome to Forbidden Files. Today, we're going somewhere most people couldn't find on a map, but that military planners in Moscow, Brussels, and Washington consider one of the most dangerous pieces of land on Earth, a place that looks like nothing and could change everything. There is a stretch of land in northeastern Europe that most people have never heard of. It looks like nothing, just fields, forests, a few small towns that barely show up on a map. 60 miles long, in places barely wider than a major city. But NATO generals have called it their Achilles heel. US military analysts have called it the most volatile point on the world map. And journalists, defense experts, and former heads of state have simply called it the most dangerous place on Earth. This is the Suwalki Gap, and understanding it means understanding exactly where a war between NATO and Russia could begin. To understand why this tiny strip of land carries so much weight, you need to go back, not to the Cold War, not to 2022, but to 1255. That is when the Teutonic Knights, a German crusader order, built a fortress city on the Baltic Sea coast and named it Königsberg, King's Mountain. For nearly 700 years, Königsberg was one of the great cities of Northern Europe, the birthplace of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, the coronation city of Prussian kings, a major Baltic port, a center of culture, trade, and military power. By the 20th century, it was a thriving German city, nearly 400,000 people, ancient churches, beautiful bridges spanning the Progolia River. Then came 1944. British bombers reduced much of the city to rubble in 2 nights of raids. And in April 1945, in one of the last major battles of World War II in Europe, the Soviet Red Army fought through the ruins and seized what was left of Königsberg. What happened next was brutal. The German population, those who survived the bombing and the battle, was expelled. Hundreds of thousands of people driven from the city their families had called home for generations. Stalin replaced them with Soviet settlers, collective farm workers, soldiers, people sent from across the USSR to populate a city they had never seen. In 1946, the city was renamed. Königsberg became Kaliningrad, named after a Soviet official. Every street, every building, every trace of 700 years of German history, renamed, demolished, or repurposed. The city the Soviets built on the ruins of Königsberg was closed to outsiders until 1987, a sealed military base on the Baltic Sea. No tourists, no foreign visitors, just soldiers, sailors, and their families. And here is the critical detail that drives everything else in this story. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and the Baltic states declared independence, Kaliningrad was suddenly cut off. No longer connected to Russia by land, surrounded on 3 sides by what would become NATO and EU territory, a Russian island in the middle of Europe, and Moscow decided to turn it into one of the most heavily armed pieces of land on the planet. Let's talk about what Russia has actually put inside Kaliningrad, because the list is extraordinary. Russia stations S-400 air defense systems there, advanced missile batteries capable of targeting aircraft across most of the Baltic region. NATO pilots operating over the Baltic Sea fly within their range. There are Iskander-M ballistic missiles with a range of up to 500 kilometers. From Kaliningrad, they can reach Warsaw, they can reach Berlin, they can reach Stockholm. The Russian Baltic Fleet is headquartered at Baltijsk. Submarines, destroyers, naval strike capacity right in the heart of European waters. Russia has also deployed MiG-31K fighters capable of carrying the Kinzhal hypersonic missile, a weapon that travels at 10 times the speed of sound and is designed to defeat missile defense systems. Military analysts call this an anti-access area denial zone. In plain language, if a conflict broke out, Russia could make it extremely difficult for NATO aircraft, ships, and reinforcements to operate across a huge portion of Northern Europe. Now let's look at the gap itself. The Suwalki Gap runs along the border between northeastern Poland and southern Lithuania. On one side, Kaliningrad. On the other side, Belarus, Russia's closest military ally, a country where Russian troops have been stationed since 2022 and never fully left. The narrowest point of the corridor is approximately 65 kilometers, about 40 miles. That is the entire land connection between the Baltic states and the rest of NATO. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, 3 NATO member states, nearly 6 million people, connected to their allies by a single strip of land that could theoretically be crossed by a military column in a matter of hours. Now, there is something important about the terrain that works against an attacker. Roughly half the corridor is covered by the Augustov primeval forest and the Bibra marshlands. These are ancient wetlands, dense forest, ground that becomes impassable for heavy armored vehicles after rain. Not the kind of terrain where tank columns move freely. Only 2 major roads and 1 rail line thread through the entire corridor. That is the complete overland infrastructure connecting 3 countries and 6 million NATO citizens to the rest of the alliance. 2 roads, 1 railway. The importance of this became very clear in 2022. In the early weeks of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russian tank columns moving on narrow roads through difficult terrain were devastated by drones and portable anti-tank missiles. The Suwalki Gap will present the same challenges to any attacker. A relatively small number of well-equipped defenders using the forest and marshland could make a mechanized attack through the gap extremely costly. In 2015, former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves stood up in front of NATO officials and pointed to the Suwalki Gap. He was the first major political figure to put it into NATO's formal strategic vocabulary. That same year, U.S. General Ben Hodges, the commander of American ground forces in Europe, described the gap as, and I quote, "one of the most volatile points on the world map." In 2016, the RAND Corporation, one of America's most influential defense think tanks, ran a series of war game simulations. The results were alarming enough that they were made public. They found that Russian forces in a surprise attack scenario could potentially reach the capitals of Estonia and Latvia within 60 hours. 60 hours, less than 3 days, before NATO reinforcements could arrive in sufficient numbers. The scenario that worries NATO planners most is a pincer attack. Russian forces pushing east from Kaliningrad, Russian and Belarusian forces pushing west from the Grodno region. The 2 forces linking up across 65 kilometers of NATO territory. If that happened, the Baltic states would be severed from NATO. No overland supply routes, no land-based reinforcements, 3 NATO member countries isolated, and the alliance would face a choice: go to war to break the blockade or accept the loss of territory for the first time in NATO's history. The geography makes this more alarming than it sounds. Russian and Belarusian military installations in the Grodno region sit just 25 kilometers from the Polish border, and in some places, just 1 kilometer from the Lithuanian border. 1 kilometer, the length of 10 city blocks. During the Cold War, NATO's nightmare scenario had a different name: the Fulda Gap. It was a stretch of open terrain in central West Germany, about 60 miles northeast of Frankfurt, where Soviet tank columns were expected to pour through in a World War III scenario. NATO spent decades and billions of dollars preparing for the Fulda Gap. Entire military doctrines were built around defending it. It defined NATO's strategy for 40 years. The Fulda Gap never became a battlefield. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union dissolved. And for a brief moment in the 1990s, it seemed like Europe had finally left these calculations behind. Then Vladimir Putin came to power, and slowly, methodically, Russia began rebuilding its military, upgrading its weapons, re-establishing influence in neighboring states. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and triggered a war in eastern Ukraine. NATO woke up, and the Suwalki Gap moved from a theoretical concern to an urgent strategic priority. Then, February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the largest land war in Europe since World War II. As part of the invasion buildup, Russia moved more than 30,000 troops into Belarus, officially for military exercises. Many of them never fully left. In 2023, following the failed Wagner Group mutiny against Moscow, thousands of Wagner mercenaries relocated to Belarus. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki publicly stated the situation in the Suwalki Gap was becoming even more dangerous. Also in 2022, Lithuania blocked Russian goods from crossing the corridor to reach Kaliningrad, enforcing EU sanctions over the Ukraine invasion. Moscow called it a hostile act. Russian officials threatened serious consequences. Some Russian commentators openly discussed military options. For a moment, the question hung in the air. Would Russia use the sanctions as a pretext for a military move through the gap? Would this be the moment? Lithuania eventually eased some of the restrictions under EU pressure. The crisis passed. For now, NATO has not sat still while all of this unfolded. After Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, the alliance created the Enhanced Forward Presence Program. Multinational combat battalions were permanently stationed in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Troops from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, France, and other allies. These forces are not large enough to stop a full Russian invasion on their own. That is not the point. The point is that any Russian attack on the Baltic states would immediately kill American soldiers, British soldiers, German soldiers, and that changes the calculation entirely. In 2016, NATO ran its largest military exercise since the Cold War, Operation Anaconda. More than 31,000 troops from 24 countries. A significant portion specifically focused on moving forces through the Suwalki corridor into Lithuania. The message to Moscow was deliberate. We can do this, we have practiced it, and we are watching. Infrastructure is also being upgraded. Rail Baltica, a major new railway project connecting the Baltic states to Poland and Western Europe, is being built with military logistics in mind. Faster troop movements, faster supply lines, a harder corridor to isolate. In October 2025, new expressway sections linking Suwalki to Lithuania's main highway network were completed, with full expressway completion planned for 2030. Every kilometer of improved road is another obstacle for anyone trying to close the gap. So here we are, back to those quiet fields, those forests, that narrow road. Ordinary people live here, farmers, small-town residents, people who go about their days without thinking about missile batteries and pincer attacks and war game simulations. But 60 miles to their north and south, the most heavily armed forces on the continent are watching the same strip of land, running the same calculations, updating the same war plans. 6 million people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are living their lives on the far side of a corridor that military planners consider one of the most strategically vulnerable points on Earth. The deterrence appears to be working. No war has started at the Suwalki Gap. No Russian forces have crossed, and most analysts believe that NATO's presence in the region is preventing the worst-case scenario. But Russia has not reduced its military capability near the corridor. Belarus remains a forward operating environment for Russian forces. Kaliningrad remains one of the most densely armed places in Europe, and the gap remains exactly as narrow as it has always been. 60 miles, 2 roads, 1 railway. Somewhere in planning rooms in Moscow, Brussels, Warsaw, and Washington, people are still staring at that 60-mile strip of land, running the numbers, updating the plans, and hoping they never have to use them. The most dangerous place on Earth looks like nothing. It always does. 60 miles. That is all that stands between 3 NATO countries and isolation. The Suwalki Gap is not in the news every day, but the people whose job it is to prevent wars never stop thinking about it. If this story made you see the map of Europe differently, that is exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe. New video every week. And next time you look at a map of Europe, find the gap.